Hi guys. Basically, this is our new podcast. We don't really know what we're doing, but we're just here. We're just gonna be yapping, but we're gonna be trying to offer a different perspective, different opinions. We're four young men in college who don't always agree with each other, but more or less, we kind of stand a little more on the center left. However, we're open to having discussion and dialogue with people all across the political spectrum. So I just want to introduce myself first. My name is Belay. I'm a senior here at UCLA studying political science and history, and I really, really, really like politics. That's also why I'm depressed half the time. Max?
Hey, well, in that case, I'm Max. I was Blaze's former coworker. That's how we met. We were both interns on Capitol Hill in the spring, and I'm a soon-to-be senior from UCSB, and I'll be applying to law school and graduate school in the fall. So, wish me the best of luck, right?
Hi, I'm David. I'm a sophomore at the University of Michigan. I'm studying architecture and political science, and I'm probably going to go and get my master's in architecture and urban planning, but still a little bit of uncertainty exactly what my career is going to look like. So,
Last but not least,
Uh,
Mr. Ben.
I'm Ben. I'm a fourth year at UC Davis in California. I'm a poli-sci major, also urban planning major, and yeah, I think maybe law school after, but we'll see. Work in politics.
Yeah. So basically, I just wanted to open the floor and kind of talk about, give a reason or two why Kamala Harris lost, why Democrats generally lost. And Ben, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest reason is the worldwide backlash against incumbents. I think any incumbent during inflation has fared pretty brutally. I'm in London right now. That's a big example of that. But I think ultimately it comes down to Joe Biden being very unpopular and Kamala not doing enough to distance herself from him and distinguish herself. But I mean, I think beyond that, there's a lot of other reasons we can delve into. I think we can focus on how young men shifted so far right and some of the causes of that. But I think ultimately it comes down to that Democrats failed to create a media environment and a national environment where those who weren't very tuned into politics were pushed to the left at all. I think that they kind of seeded that entire field, especially between the elections with Biden in office. And I think hopefully something like this can help. But I think ultimately they need to focus more on how to get people who aren't tuned into politics to be vague liberals, not necessarily be super partisan, but to vaguely side with the left on things where I think there's a lot of people who are vaguely conservative or vaguely Trump supporters who are not very tuned in. And I think that was a huge cause of the shift.
yeah, I would say, I think, Ben said a lot of things that I agree with, but I guess something that I'll exemplify more that I think is a big issue is I think Democrats ran way too high level of a nuanced campaign, like high amounts of information. I think that this election was a turning point in terms of the amount of like nuance of information that percolates down to the electorate. Like I think like we obviously saw some of it over time, but I think like right now the new low information voter I think is Democrats' biggest issue. I think they're going overwhelming because obviously there's a lot of parts of the Democratic coalition. Both parties have low information voters, but I think of the new voters in in 2024, the low it's just that Democrats did not have effective narratives at low levels at digestible I'll say digestible levels of information. Like in Texas, new voters were like it might have been 80-20 to Republicans, and new voters, if I had to guess, are pretty overwhelmingly like the people who pay the least amount of attention to politics, and it's about translating kind of what they're seeing like minute changes in their lives on the ground to overall like ideological kind of ideas. And I think Republicans did that very well. And they're obviously aided by being an anti incumbent party. But I think the biggest thing that Democrats failed to do is create very, very simplistic and digestible policies that people, or not policies, but rather messaging that people were able to connect and feel like resonated. So,
Yeah, that's a really good point, David. I was gonna say you guys both, like Ben and David, obviously connected like three really big things. I think this is one of those big circles of like an anatomy of a failure, right? Media environment, like anti-incumbency, like inflation. Like obviously those are the boring answers of like why we lost. But then of course like digestible bites. David just touched on something kind of valuable. Like and obviously I can't prove this to be true, but like somewhere it was reported that a lot of Warrenites, like Warren alumni and a lot of like high educated progressives were the ones operating these campaigns. And so it's like, yeah, Harris won high income and high education earners because the messaging was so complex. Like it's not really fair to reach those low information like voters. And so you don't win an election by like only swinging high education, high income. And all I just say, like, it turns into that whole like anti-incumbency thing, the messaging environments and like communication failures. Because like I said, it was too complex for low information voters. And like we can talk all live long day about Joe Rogan and all those failures of not going and reaching people where they are. But also this high education, like Harris posting a complex housing plan is awesome, right? I'm guessing all of us are fairly familiar with housing policy. We know it's like a supply issue. You know, you got to build more. You can't just rent control your way out of it. But like that doesn't work for the average person, right? You really got to dumb it down and make it simple. Dumb it down is kind of a rude word, but simplify, because you know the basics of communication is just me sending information to you through language, and like it's going to get filtered through all these different channels. You make it as simple as possible. And then I'll take you and I'll raise you one that I haven't seen really many people discuss, is there's this cultural like perception of failure from blue states and like blue cities. You know, you think homelessness, drug crises, like housing prices, and people are fleeing these like blue areas, even if California's still growing and people still want to move there because it's California, like, or New York, right? People are like, hey, it's too expensive to live. There's like homeless people over the streets and drug use is everywhere. And so I think that's actually a long-term project that like Democrats, liberals, conservative, moderates, and like progressives have kind of failed, is that blue state governance is kind of associated with failure, right? You think Jimmy Carter, you think, I mean, Bill Clinton's probably the only exception, but like even Obama, people don't look at him as like this great victory. They look as, oh, I liked him, but like, you know, maybe Obamacare, they don't know too much, and especially Biden looking like a failure to the American people, right? Despite the 117th and him having a great legislative record, or California having all these, you know, great like macro environments and business, not business friendly, but growth and all this money and all these kind of things, but people are still mad about it. They think high cost of living. And that's kind of the end all be all. Like blue states and blue cities need to get better at governing things. You know, we can't be having, what is it, La Sombrera, like that. I'm sure you guys saw that thing of
La Sombrita, yeah.
Yes, that little post like for 200,000. You're kidding, right? You know, you think like Austin, Texas, or Florida, where they're building so much housing that like rents are going down 9-7% year over year, like just crazy amounts. You know,
that's honestly one of Democrats' I think most difficult long-term issues, is you have to change the perceptions of cities as places of corruption and just like kind of like the rot of like our civic structures. Because in fact, you know, many cities are actually getting significantly less dangerous. There's a lot of efforts that are working, like specifically in Detroit, which is, you know, you can't get more democratic governance than that. There's been initiatives that have been hugely effective in reducing crime in nearly every variety. And it's actually been focused on a lot of like the DPD has been focused on a lot of mental health initiatives, which is, you know, things like that are very difficult to do and to explain in this info environment. But on the other hand, it's not just about democratic governments, it's just local governments. Local governance in general is like terrible. If you're to go to like small, it varies greatly. Like there are some well-run cities and small and badly run cities, but it's just that bureaucracy and like checks and balances break down, I think, when you get to a local level, because it's based on personalities. There's just it's kind of like just a worse version of like the constitutional system that we have broadly. But it's just that small towns towns that are run by Republicans, like those level of you know, subdivisions that are run by Republicans, are so much smaller in their population that you're not going to hear about, you know, corruption in a town of 3,000 people in Mississippi, even though there's hundreds, if not thousands of them. So that's definitely kind of an information type issue, I think. I think obviously that blue state governance and blue city governance needs to improve, but I think it's also just as much an information issue.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Like that whole communication thing is just, it's a total failure on, like I say, like liberal and democratic parts. You know, you think Elon Musk, Rogan, like all these like right-wing influencers can reach millions of people, especially like TikTok and all these things that we need to break through on that. But I mean, I'll push back again and be like, think of like California, right? I mean, obviously where I live in California, I've been here for like my whole life, born and raised. If California was perceived, right, in this public perception of like, hey, this is a place where it's abundance, it's jobs, it's relatively cheap housing. Like, I know it's a lot easier said than done, but like, think of what it could be of a place of abundance of, you know, plentiful housing, job opportunities, great environment. You know, if people could point to democratic areas as like, hey, look at California as a good example of a great success, right? A world leader in tech, in AI research, in climate stuff. And on top of that, robust job growth for working class people, housing for everyone, or for people who want like housing here, cheap rents, any number of things. Like we need to be able to point to successes too, and make it really simple communication rather than the perception of like San Francisco as a out of touch, super expensive, drug-ridden hellhole. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think what you're talking about with how like crime statistics are actually down, or in some specific cities as well, where I don't think those statistics really matter. It's about how people perceive them. And I think it's a lot of these things are very aesthetic and very vibe based, and it's the perception. So like the perception of disorder, I think, is what really characterizes democratic cities. And like I think of something like homeless statistics, where some cities like Sacramento, I know, have like reduced their homelessness population. But I think the homelessness population that causes political issues is not the actual homelessness statistic. It's the visible homelessness. And that's a separate statistic. And I think like those are the kinds of things that people take note of, and just the general feeling that disorder is allowed in blue cities, I think has sort of characterized it. It's very small things that don't actually like in a big picture statistical environment make a difference, but just feeling like, oh, there's like someone can be crazy on the bus and nothing's going to happen. And just those kinds of aesthetic things that maybe aren't actually going to make a difference in the crime statistics overall. But I think that's what drives people to have these perceptions of blue cities. And I also think generally people just kind of perceive Democrats as having been in charge for a while. I mean, if you take out like there's a 4-year gap with Trump, but really like there's like 12 years of Democratic governance since Obama, where and especially all these blue states where I think people just kind of like combined with some nostalgia bias just are like, oh, well, under this Democratic rule, things seem to have gotten so chaotic, even though Trump was president during COVID and everything. But I think that is a huge part.
I think that you guys kind of all hit the point here. I think Democrats just suck at speaking to people who aren't in their base already. We have a really hard time just like, I feel like we just look down at a lot of people. And instead of saying like, there were a lot of Democrats, and I was doing this for a while. I was like, my friends are like, oh, like, it doesn't feel safe out here. Crime is up under Joe Biden. I'm like, no, guys, actually violent crime is down, right? Violent crime is low. It's like hitting a 40, 50-year low, but it doesn't matter because people feel unsafe, right? It goes back to like us talking about how good the economy has been. Well, go say that to the single mother who has like 2 kids, and her grocery bill is like 30% higher now. She doesn't know that, hey, the stock market might be at an all-time high. We're creating a lot of jobs, but that doesn't matter to her, right? So I think we need to understand that we need to stop telling people how they feel. We need to understand how they feel, listen to them, and then come up with some practical, common sense policy that's easy to digest. And Max and I have talked about this before, right? It's not that Americans are quote, and I don't like when people say Americans are too dumb to understand our. I'm not saying you guys are saying this, but there's Democratic elite who say Americans are too dumb to understand our policies. No, Americans do not have the time to go and delve and research our policy. They are working 2 jobs a day. They're taking care of their kids. They can't afford their student loans. They can barely afford rent. We need to come up with policy that is easy, simple, and that works. So it doesn't have to be the most flashy housing policy. We can literally go out there and be like, one thing that Kamala Harris did say that was good was like, we're going to build 3 million more homes. Fuck yeah. We're going to build 3 million more homes. We're going to work with the private industry. I actually think in terms of all policy, I heard from normie Americans, just the average American, most Americans from what I know understood her housing policy. It was like build more homes and then the $25,000 tax credit. I know there's economists out there like, well, that's very stupid. Oh my God, it's going to drive up. I'm like, but guess what? People understood it. Exactly. People understood it.
Economists in campaigns.
Exactly.
Well,
and people understood that policy.
Are for governance. They're not for winning.
Yeah. Keep them there.
And I think it's true that we need digestible policy, but I also think we need digestible messaging of that policy, which I think goes hand in hand. But I would argue that, yes, I think we need to listen to voters where they are, and everything you're saying is very true. But I would argue like during the Trump years, every single time he went on stage, every time you saw him, every speech, the way he would talk about the economy, the way he would brag about the economy, frankly, I think was completely absent in the Biden years. And I understand why, considering that there was a lot of hardship and like initially wages weren't keeping up with inflation. But I also think that maybe Biden didn't feel comfortable doing this, and maybe he lacked the ability to do this. But I think we just seeded the market of vibes about the economy completely. And if he was more Trumpian in his bragging about it, maybe it wouldn't have worked. But I think there's a chance it would have. I think if people constantly heard a message of it being good, they would have a more positive feeling.
Well, Ben, I'll push back a little bit because he coined the term like Bidenomics. He did try bragging about it. He attached his name to the economy. So maybe if he went out there and they talked about more, like if they talked about the IRA, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, do you guys understand how many people had no idea that that bill was even a thing, that that bill passed, that it lowered insulin to $15 a month for seniors, that it capped, like I was telling, my aunt, like, oh yeah, it's like the bill caps out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for seniors at $2,000 a year. She's like, I didn't hear about this. I have no idea about this. And it goes back to messaging, being able to like actually talk about this policy. But it also goes back to like, I think at the end of the day, we just had a bad messenger at top on the top. I think that Biden's way too old. People didn't really understand what he was saying. If like, and I don't think, if Obama was in this position right now, I think he would have won re-election. Actually, we could talk about that much later, but he would have been able to message it a lot better. But I think that we just have like the Trump years. I understand he was talking about how good the economy is, but at the end of the day, you actually asked Americans how the economy was doing. Most said, it was fair. It was just solid. It wasn't the best, but it was solid. So yes, you can try to spin your way out of things, but if Americans don't feel that way, good luck.
I think there's a balance between what Americans feel and what is real, because when you're something that I'm very pessimistic about is like the flip in the partisan consumer sentiment reports. I think there's a balance between frustration and warranted level of frustration. I don't know what it is, but I think like Democrats definitely, they go too hard on Cristolicizing almost everything, but I don't know where the balance is, and I don't know what the right message is to voters, because I don't know if you can capitulate and say, you're right, the economy is terrible, this is like the Great Depression, because it's just not. And if you're saying that, that's going to hurt you long run. But you also can't say like your life is perfect, clearly. But Kamala Harris didn't even do that, to her credit. I mean, I think she could have done better messaging, but she was definitely not trying to say that the economy.
I agree. I think she did everything she could in that regard.
I think this is also just a problem with Democrats, where I think they're better positioned to be a challenging party, not an incumbent, because I think when you're talking about like the partisan splits of consumer sentiment, I think like Republicans are more comfortable. The second a Republican takes control, they're going to talk about how great the economy is nonstop, whether it is or not. And I think Democrats are, like rank and file Democrats, are more hesitant to do that. I think they're generally, I mean, our policies are built to help struggling working class people. That's like the goal of the party. And so I think they don't feel as comfortable talking about how good things are. I think they feel more like, oh, well, the lived experience of people. And so I think that was sort of also a problem over the last 4 years of just like regular Democrats were too quick to like enjoy being doomery about the economy and be like, yes, like things are horrible. And there wasn't this kind of space to propagandize the economy, frankly. And like, I do wonder if that contributes a little bit.
Well, the better question is like, obviously people know how much they hate inflation. And so it's like, it's one of those things where we all understand like basic macro, where like the president has so much limited control. Like obviously you get fiscal stimulus, you get all these spending bills, but the question is like, people still didn't feel it. And it's like, I guess, where's that disconnect? Is it disconnect with the level of prices? Is it the visible prices, things like gas, rent, whatever? And like you said, with the inverse consumer price index flipping, like it's kind of becoming a measure of partisanship. Like I'm sure we all saw that one change where like now that Trump is like president, he's not even in.
It's totally like inverse. It's
just genuinely a partisan thing. And so it's like, the question is, how do we break through with that sentiment of like, for example, social media, right? Social media is the communication thing. People are getting all their news from TikTok, like young people, middle-aged people. It's just pervasive. And so you have people going on there talking about bed rotting, how expensive things are, all these things. And it's like, it doesn't even have to be true necessarily, but the messaging is there. And so it's one of those things of like, how do you brag like econ stats and econometrics of like, hey, GDP growth is the strongest in the world. Like, how do you communicate these things in simple terms? Or rather than that, just empathize with the people that are making these gains. And I've had this theory for a while now. I'm sure we all have seen the whole quantiles of like who has made the most since the pandemic, and like it's being the lower 50%. Lower 50% workers, meaning wage workers, laborers, construction workers, fast food, yada yada. have seen like the largest growth share in the last whatever 5 years since the economy of since COVID rebound and whatnot, because of tight labor markets, because a whole different set of conditions. But those aren't the people that are posting on social media. You think Twitter, TikTok, whatever. You're probably not someone who works a 12-hour shift at McDonald's and then goes home and takes care of your kid, right? You're probably $100,000 income plus, like upper middle class person who's complaining about the private taxi for your burrito being too expensive, right? So it's hard to balance these like macroeconomic like views,
I'm pretty like generally disillusioned with a lot of Bernie Sanders like policies. Like I definitely would have voted for him in 16, probably 20. But I think just the general anger at corporations and rich people that's not even necessarily founded necessarily 100% in economic reality needs to be reinvigorated, because I think it was one of the only sentiments that is pervasive enough to match the Republican messaging and outflank Republican messaging.
100%. My friend Luis Max knows him, big econ major and poli sci too, but he was like, why does Kamala Harris keep blaming corporations for inflation? Like, that's not true. That's not true. And I told him, like, pure simply, she can either blame Joe Biden or she can blame corporations. And she's not going to blame her boss. She's going to blame corporations because that is the politically advantage. Yeah. So I had to explain to him.
I have lots.
That's what, and when you actually poll Americans about who's to blame for inflation, corporations are actually above Joe Biden. Like, they are above, like, even a sizable chunk of Republicans are like, yeah, they are like, trying to make us squeeze as much out of us. And that's a sentiment that's felt across the political spectrum. So I agree, David. Yeah.
If you look at the ideological placement of the parties, this is probably the least corporate-friendly Republican electorate in a very long time. So
yeah, I also think, like you were talking about social media and how like those people are posting. I also think social media is just generally has a huge negativity bias, and I think that things are way more likely to go viral if they're talking about how shitty things are than generally being like, oh, things are actually okay right now. So I don't know how you fix that. I don't even know if it is fixable. And frankly, that gives me some hope that things will continue to be negative during the Trump years. I don't think people are necessarily going to switch to being like, oh, the economy's great. Maybe partisans will, but I don't think that's going to suddenly start going viral.
I completely agree with that I'm nervous about people ignoring the bad things that Trump is going to be doing in relation to democratic norms, but he just does so many flashy negative things, even more so than he'll do in his first term, that I think that Republicans harness the current media environment, and they have a lot of proponents that like big figures like Elon Musk, but I alternatively think it's totally out of their control. Like, it happened to work in their favor this time, but I don't think it will now that they're the incumbents in every.
Well, yeah, it's like a roadblock. Given like historical like analysis, like how the Republican Congress works, and you think they run their leaders out of town really quickly. Like, I think when we were in like our UCG's program, right, we were studying under Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff, right? And he was telling us a story about how John Boehner, when he won the House, they're in the elevator and he like congratulates him, and Boehner tells him that within a year or two, he'll be more popular in the Democratic caucus than he would be in his Republican conference. And it's like, the issue with Republicans is like when you move so far right, you have these like, I don't know, 100 Republican study members that are like, hey, we just want to trim the federal budget and cut some income taxes. And then you have House Freedom Caucuses talking about like Jewish space lasers and all these crazy things. And like they want to repeal Biden's like Inflation Reduction Act, or like any of these like industrial policies that are actually really beneficial to red districts. I think that's actually one of the hallmarks of this next Trump administration is going to be the road bumps, right? The question is, do they try and cut Social Security? Like, if the Department of Government Efficiency gives these recommendations of like, hey, do we cut Social Security? Do we cut Medicare? It's like, there's going to be blowback to that. There's going to be blowback when the mass deportations start and all of a sudden people are seeing videos of federal agents kicking down doors. That's not going to fly. And like, the question is, when does the media environment pivot? And like, there's so many different factors at play here that it's both scary and interesting, because one, there is going to be blowback. Like, that's just how politics work. Pendulums swing back and forth. But also, Trump is an interesting person who has certain patterns where, depending on who's talking to him, he'll do any sort of thing. So like, realistically speaking, if he decides, I'm not interested in this tariffs thing because the markets went this way, or RFK in charge of like HHS, markets go this way instead of this way, he's very likely to pivot because, again, his thing is Fox and Friends of what he sees, So it's going to be an interesting couple years of like, if we can be smart enough to propagate like I've been thinking of like how Democrats could retake like a big House majority. Think the 2006 playbook of like rock the vote, but except it's anti-Trump vote. It's going to be running conservative Democrats, expanding the big tent back to what it used to be. We need divergent voices in the caucus, and like running in those red districts are the only way we're going to do that. We're not going to do that with Portland level progressivism in North Dakota. We're doing that with farmers that are like, hey, I'm pro union, I'm pro this, but
yes,
honestly, that's not too much. We need to
tax the rich, like Osborne, like what Osborne did in Nebraska. I think is like a really good playbook for Democrats. Real quick though, I do want to touch on one thing, Ben. If you want to talk about kind of the rightward shift amongst young men, I saw today that men under 29, I think Biden won them by 56%, and Trump, I think, is about to win them by 56%. So that's like a what? I'm not good at math. That's a big swing. So, yeah. Ben, if you want to talk about that real quick.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to discuss with this, but my general theory of it is entirely vibes based for the most part. I mean, I think all the social media negativity around the economy is true for young men and anyone else who's online. But I think we should talk about how I think Democrats have like completely failed in their messaging to young men. I think they've completely like seeded the environment, and I think generally like talking to people in my frat, just talking to like friends in sports and stuff who are like, they're not big Trump guys, but they're vaguely conservative. I think you can honestly tie all that back to the Democrats being unable to shake this image that sort of started in 2016 of like the screeching liberal with purple hair who's upset about Trump winning. And I think that has been, even though I would argue Democrats have kind of moved away from that, I would argue that has like been sticky, that image of them.
The image is still there.
It's gonna take more time and effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think that like a lot of the culture war battles and there's just some of them that Kamala, to be fair, didn't really talk about them, but still hurt her. Like her 2020 campaign hurt her, right? Like the them ad that hurt her. And there's a lot of young men who probably agree with us on a good amount of issues, but they were kind of seen as a little too extreme on some issues that we'll talk about in further episodes. But I do want to just go through everyone, just like a quick, like 2-3 words, something that you're hopeful for in the next 4 years, something that could be within the Democratic Party, whatever it is. I would say I'm hopeful for bacon going down in price because Trump kept talking about how he was going to bring the price of bacon down to $2. So if it's not down to $2 by January 20th, 2025, I'm voting to impeach him.
I was going to say, I think what I'm hopeful for is, after like a defeat where we can't point to anything, right? We can't blame one big issue. It's not like the Electoral College screwed us. It's nothing like that. We're going to have to take an inflection point for the Democratic Party and look forward for 2026, 28, and all these future elections of how we're going to be competitive again. The electoral efficiency of our coalition was there, but we just didn't swing people. And so I'm hopeful for the next few years being a rebuilding and I would say a Democratic resurgence, right? A rebuilding of the party and going in a new way forward. Like Harris kind of laid down on the sword and then actually in turn created a new way forward, right?
Yeah, I'm actually a little shift in the more near term. I'm optimistic about Ukraine because Trump's rhetoric and the people he's appointed has been a lot better than I was worried about. So
I would say I'm optimistic about just the dynamics of the media and general environment with social media shifting to now be in our favor. I think the negativity bias will continue, and I think that will benefit us now that Trump's in power, and we don't really have to worry about how to message positive things until we take power again. And maybe by then social media is less insane and people are more willing to hear positive things. But I think in the meantime, Democrats are real good at being negative, and that will now be good for our purposes of making people not like the incumbent president and have backlash against him.
Armand, thank you for joining us and responding to my Twitter comment, or now known as X, but I'll still call it Twitter. But yeah, we're excited.
Never call it X. Like that is
never,
the only naming that I do is I will never call Twitter X. It's Twitter.
It's Twitter. It's still Twitter here. I mean, the domain's still Twitter when you search it up. So that's great. Basically, we're just 4 young men in college currently. Creating a different podcast sphere, some alternative media in the podcast world. So we will be talking about all sorts of topics in this conversation, but obviously housing policy will be, first and forefront. And then Max, if you want to introduce our guest.
Awesome. So first and foremost, we have the Twitter infamous Armand Domalewski. Make sure I got that right because that is hard for me to read. But hey, good to have you on. Good to have you be here. I gotta say, we're all big fans of your work, big fans of YIMBYs for Harris. I gotta say, congratulations on raising, what was it, over 136 was it $1,000?
By the end, 147,000.
$147,000. That's a lot of zeros and more money than I'll probably ever see in my life. But we have Armand Domalewski. We're lucky enough to have some time to chat with him. We talked about the future of YIMBYism, San Francisco, Mayor London Breed, any number of things, Grow SF, whatever's on your mind. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you, Mr. Domalewski. I got a couple questions for you in particular about YIMBYism, the future of YIMBYism, and your work in particular in San Francisco. So I guess my first question to you is, where do we see the YIMBY movement going? I'm sure, as you were aware, the bipartisan YIMBY caucus was established, but where do you see this future going?
One thing I'll say before I even talk about that I'm just like weirdly proud of. I don't know if you guys saw, but I was a little frustrated about Congressman Ro Khanna talking about some issues of manufacturing in the Midwest. And, I live in the Bay Area. The number one issue for all of us here is still housing. It's incredibly expensive. And I was like, hey man, like, sure, it's nice that you want to rebuild manufacturing in the Midwest, and I really care about that, but like, what are you doing to make it so that anybody can afford to live here? And he responded politely, and I almost feel a little bad because I've been a little aggro. And he's like, oh, well, I consider myself a YIMBY. I'm trying. And so then I said, hey, you should join the YIMBY caucus with Robert Garcia. And he's like, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. And Robert Garcia responded because we knew him through YIMBYs for Harris. And then he became a member. I was like, holy shit. So if anybody ever tells you you're wasting your time on Twitter and your life on Twitter, they're probably correct, but you can tell them that it matters anyway. That said, the YIMBY movement as a whole. So I started this stuff 2015, 2014. I worked as an economic policy analyst working on low-income housing tax credits for this company called Novogradac, which is basically the biggest private company in America in accounting or that specializes in tax credits, or those tax credits specifically. And so I had a policy background in it. I had experience around it, and I went to this panel that was interesting by this woman named Sonia Traus about housing and YIMBYism. And I'd already heard a lot of this stuff in my work about both affordable housing projects we dealt with, where funding was a huge obstacle, but the second biggest obstacle was relentless local opposition. And that woman is a very unique character. Whether you hate her or love her, she's will make an impression. And within a week, my roommate's like, who's this crazy woman you're following around everywhere? You're going to all what's the Sunshine Task Force? And it's just us and a band of misfit toys following her and growing and growing. And all this is to say that when people ask me what do you think of the future YIMBY movement? I've gotten a lot of attention to the YIMBYs for Harris, and I'm a diva. I love attention. It's fine. But I don't want to make it seem like I am the oracle of all YIMBY. I think my perspective comes from it not being a movement's leader necessarily. I lead some things, but more, I think my most important perspective is from being somebody who was in the trenches. And from that perspective, the way I think it's moving, there's some things that are promising and some things that are frustrating. I would say on the promising side of it, the two things are one, it is very much something that has gotten national attention. It was never the case before, that people in Ohio or Wisconsin or Michigan are really concerned about YIMBYism, right? Because housing was expensive in San Francisco and New York, but unfortunately, it's expensive everywhere. But the positive side of it is that people are nationally really concerned about and understanding how it's a problem. I would say the second piece is that has really had a strong effect within the Democratic Party. So I think Congressman Khanna is a good example of somebody who, I don't think he was ever a NIMBY, but something I've always held a grudge against him is that early on in his term, he held this housing panel, and he had people who were YIMBY, but then he also had this woman named Lydia Ko, who's a realtor in Palo Alto, was in the city council, recently ran for assembly, and she ate shit, thank God. And she's very infamous for saying, there's no housing crisis, you just need a good realtor like me. And he it was there was a point in time where Democratic politicians thought that like that was a housing voice that was equally legitimate to like pro-housing YIMBY people, right? And that was not good. And we've moved a long way away from that. So I think those two things are really positive. I think the really dangerous thing, honestly, now is that Trump is in charge. Republicans are pretty dominant. And I think how this operates in this new area, I mean, I think it's very smart that the EMB caucus is bipartisan. I hope that will be helpful, but it's also true that like, Donald Trump has very few personal ideological commitments. One of them is like really hating foreigners, immigration. Two is like tariffs, again, hating foreigners. Three is his personal NIMBYism runs really deep. Like people think he's a YIMBY because he's a developer, but he was always a developer of primarily like commercial properties. And even when he owned properties, he was constantly fighting to oppose people building stuff near him. So he very famously has a feud with the entire nation of Scotland because he tried to get them to stop building like windmills near his golf course. And he campaigned pretty explicitly. So, for example, when he was with Ben Carson as and I know this answer is long and rambling, so I'll finish in a moment. But I guess this big opening statement with what really frustrates me locally is so I used to work for Senator Scott Wiener, probably one of the biggest, best like housing champions in America, one of the earliest like sort of elected to really be a leader of the UB movement. And people at NSF who are sort of like the SF left are constantly be like, you guys are crypto Republicans, Scott Wiener's a corporate sellout, blah, blah, blah. But Donald Trump wrote an op-ed in Wall Street Journal with Ben Carson, which explicitly called out Senator Scott Wiener. Like they said, we oppose this bill he's trying to pass, so make it easier to build housing in the suburbs. A lot of Project 2025, all their stuff around housing was like, we need to protect single family neighborhoods and we need to like oppose like efforts to, change zoning and so on. And so that is really concerning because those people now have a lot of power and I don't know how they will wield it. That said, they're also one thing I saw that was promising was that when I ran YIMBYs for Harris, a lot of the GOP pushback I got was not because this is something we were all very concerned about is like polarizing the issue, but it was not, oh, well, like NIMBYism is for Republicans and like YIMBYs are, blah, blah, blah. Most of the right-wing pushback I got was like, you guys are idiots. Where are the real YIMBYs? Da, da, da. Which is, I don't think is true, but I think that's a better, healthy response. Like if both parties are competing to be more pro-housing, that's the healthy way out. So really to summarize, two positive things are it's national, Democrats are starting to embrace it. Mixed thing is like how Republicans in power will deal with it. There's warning signs, but there's also opportunities. So we'll see.
So that's a really good point. I was going to say, I got one more for you before I pass you off to Ben, David, and Belay. But a really interesting point you've raised is the competition between, Republicans and Democrats about who is more YIMBY. And I'm sure you've seen, Noah Smith and other, prominent thinkers, Matt Iglesias, about these abundance agendas, right? Things like the IRA, the clean energy tax credits, which I'm sure you're well aware has been predominantly benefiting rural red communities. And so one of the things, I guess, from my background, right, I am from a small rural exurb of Los Angeles where a large green energy storage facility is going through. A lot of the NIMBYs are fighting it despite my 6,000 person town desperately in need of jobs, which would bring close to 10,000 jobs, all high paying kind of stuff, right? But all that to say, these red communities are resisting through NIMBYism, through fighting them through NEPA, through all these environmental regulations. And so with regards to YIMBYism as a pro-abundance, pro-housing, free trade, all this abundance agenda policy, how do you see YIMBYism and the broader abundance agenda going forward? What would you like to see in regards, climate, obviously housing, and how these become intertwined, right? A more rather than less approach to energy, to housing, as a method of fighting pretty much the most pressing issues of our time. And what would you prefer to see? What would you like to see? And what format would you like to see it take place?
Well, so the reason that a lot of this development is happening in red areas, despite what you're saying there, is because it's really interesting. I had this tweet go viral a while ago that would like sort of summarize how I felt about it, which I thought was like that California is a place that every elected official will fall over themselves backwards to talk about how they love clean energy. We need to save the environment. We need to get rid of plastic straws and plastic bags and like all this stuff. And yet, like Texas is building more, not just for a while, people were like, Texas builds more solar because the geography, it's just a geography question. But like now they're beating California in batteries, which is not at all like that. And the joke I had in the Twitter tweet was like California will tell you, oh my God, we love clean energy. Please just fill out this like 3,000-page application, and we're gonna listen to these lawsuits from cranky homeowners who think that this battery is gonna make their child gay, and then these other groups that think that this battery is capitalism and will make their child straight, and like, but no, we swear we love it. And then Texas will say, you want to build like a solar plant? I don't know, sounds gay, brother, but okay, and stamps it off, right? Like, there are structural things. Like there are mass movement issues. Like you're never going to get YIMBYism if you don't get a lot of people to like it and to support it. But there are also just structural things of like, if you give people an avenue to block and oppose things and create lots and lots of opportunities for it, there will always be people who want to oppose it. You're actually creating an incentive for it, right? Because a big issue in California is around, for example, like labor has for a long time. I think they've really turned around. There's a lot of like pro-housing stuff around labor, but labor's never anti-housing. But labor understandably is working out for the interests of its members and wants to ensure that labor builds, gets good contracts and gets to build housing and so on. And their avenue to do this was primarily the California Environmental Quality Act. And so you had this like bizarre situation where people would put up like fake lawsuits with like pretty much fake studies of like environmental concerns, and then they negotiate a deal with like the labor union to be like, we'll bring in the workers you want, and I don't want to get into technical terms, but there's like high road and all these other things, and skilled and trained. And then they drop the lawsuit, and you'd be like, as a outside observer, you'd be like, oh, so wait, why did raising wages for the workers suddenly resolve these environmental concerns? And like they didn't, right? It's just like this is the avenue we've created. And so I think there are things like making sure that workers are paid well, that we protect unions, are good social goals, but we need to make it so I think it is better that we like pass laws that achieve those goals directly, as opposed to passing laws that allow people to like obstruct things and make every individual thing a negotiation, so that people know that they can extract value, and it doesn't actually, it undermines the whole purpose for everybody. And really the big difference in those red areas is like a lot of those people, with housing, at least there's like some, you can say like tangible, real concerns of like there'll be more traffic or whatever. But a lot of them, there are people who oppose windmills offshore that they physically cannot even see. But just the thought that there is a windmill offshore upsets them enough that they'll do a bunch of lawsuits. Like at Martha's Vineyard, I think they had like 33 losses that to get through it, and 32 have already lost, but that's time and cost and so on. And even if the lawsuit's BS, they can still drag you out forever.
Right. And I think you've really raised a good point. I think you posted about Ezra Klein's recent podcast episode about these institutions that are allowing and preserving these abilities for people to contest, hold it up. I think a really good example was the jumping through the hoops metaphor, where rather than actually addressing these issues or removing the barriers, it's becoming more complicated. Things like NEPA, or like you said, all these lawsuits that are, pardon my French, but just bullshit. And so, I gotta say that's actually a really good point. And I don't know, I guess to simplify, so for any viewers who might not understand it with all the jargon, there's a lot of hoops where things are getting caught wrong, and making it far too difficult. And so these barriers are what we in the future would need to remove, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, and in a way that I think there are a lot of people will say, well, we need these because they're legitimate social goals, right? Like making sure that it doesn't, whatever this project is, doesn't actually harm the environment, or making sure that people who are working on it are not exploited. My philosophy is that like we should address those goals directly, as opposed to the process we have now is we write laws like CEQA and NEPA, which say you have to address any potential harm, and it keeps growing and growing and growing because there's no codified statute of it. And really, a lot of them, for example, with NEPA, it doesn't even actually require you to mitigate it. The way it works is you need to do a study that's so comprehensive, it catches any potential issue, and then people will sue you because they'll say, well, there's this one you didn't think of.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always think of more. Like in California, they invented like out of whole cloth this idea that student noise is pollution, and we have to pass a law to reverse it.
Right.
And so when you have these law, like the way that the laws are structured is not actually conducive to accomplishing these social goals. I think the better structure is to say, here's, and that also forces you to weigh trade-offs, because then you can say, okay, well, if we give this percentage for like budgeting for labor costs, and this percentage for like mitigating this potential environmental concern, these projects won't pencil. And so if we want these projects to get built, either we say, well, it's not worth it, they don't get built, or you can say, well, we'll allocate it this way and this way, set the rules of the game ahead of time and let it operate, as opposed to like just the friction costs of the fight are huge and enormous waste of time.
Absolutely. And I think one of the, I guess, like with all that, a really good example, like the California high-speed rail, which you mentioned earlier. Obviously, we've been allocating what, billions of dollars, and it's still, what, 15 years later, not nobody can ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles. So
You know what's crazy?
all,
So many people
yeah.
think like Republicans are like, oh, well, it's all wasted on like government bureaucrats, or like these unions are just getting money and like building it slowly and effectively. And it's like, it's even worse than that. We are spending all the lawyers.
It's the funniest thing in the world. I love the government bureaucrat argument, especially because it tells me you've never worked in government or had to work with government, because we make so little. It is hard to even explain how little money we make. But all that to say, it's like you said, lawyers issues. I'm gonna go ahead and throw you off to Ben. Ben, you're on up. So
Yeah, so
thank you for that.
I'd like to go back to something you were talking about, the risks of polarizing the YIMBY issue. And I'm curious, like, to get your thoughts on that. Like, is it necessarily actually bad if YIMBYism becomes like a Democrat coded issue or stance? Because I'm wondering, like, with Kamala having run on it in 2024, and I could definitely foresee that becoming kind of a hot button issue in the 2028 primary, maybe similar to how healthcare acted last time. And what I'm wondering is that actually that much of a risk, considering how a lot of the areas that we need YIMBYism the most are controlled by Democrats? Places like San Francisco, California, major cities in general. And so I'm wondering if it becomes like like if we got Republicans running on how terrible YIMBYism is, could that actually maybe be good because it forces Democrats nationwide and in these places where we need YIMBYism enacted to kind of feel like, oh, this is the Democratic stance. This is me standing up to Trump by supporting all these YIMBY policies. And just sort of your view on the risks of polarizing the YIMBY issue.
I think the challenge is if you could get it to a place where like 100% of Democrats are just like all in YIMBYs, then it would be worth it, because places like New York and California, which are sort of the biggest obstacles, would go full YIMBY. I think what you're seeing, though, is that even though most Democrats are now moving towards YIMBYism, there's still enough of a cohort of like left NIMBY people that they can form alliances with Republicans. I think it's really reprehensible. It's what happens to block things. And so New York City Council, recent example, they're trying to pass this thing called City of Yes, right? Which is this like big effort to make it easier to build housing in New York. And the Republicans on the council are, and there are Republicans in the New York City Council because New York's so big and has so many seats that like, there are Republicans on it. And they are really dug in on like parking mandates, like can't remove parking and so on. If it was just them versus all the Democrats, we wouldn't have to care. It would pass. But the issue is there were enough like left NIMBY Democrats on the city council who like don't like building market rate housing for sort of like left-wing reasons, that they were enough to form a coalition to block things. And so that then forced people to like negotiate with the Republicans and have to give in on some of the parking stuff, which I think is just like insane. It's like we abolished parking mandates in San Francisco, but you can't do it in New York City. Like, really? Like, but anyway, like So, and you see this in the California state legislature where there are enough, and this is not, with California state legislatures a mix. There's some like California Democrats in the legislature who are like NIMBY-ish from a moderate perspective, some from a left perspective. But because we've not fully won the battle where like all Democrats are in on it, we do often need to carve off like at least a few Republican votes to get things passed. And so it is a tricky balance. I don't know the full right answer. I think if we could get like every Democrat in America to be like, I'm a YIMBY all in, then that trade-off would be worth it. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I think we're getting closer, but it'll be a long fight. Don't think we can afford to just be like, yeah, screw it. Like we can make it polarized and all Republicans are NIMBYs. The seats and allocations and geography don't work for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then going back to something else you said earlier, I saw a tweet of yours that I thought was interesting, talking about how some Democrats have kind of taken the wrong lesson from the 2024 election, talking about the need to like move on from neoliberalism when the main backlash that fueled this result was complaints about how high prices were. So kind of moving towards more of a protectionist agenda is probably counterintuitive there. And so I'm kind of wondering, do you feel like we were talking about trade-offs earlier and how unions often with some of the housing stuff have some of like the prevailing wage provisions have made it a little harder to build. Do you feel like the shift of unions towards Trump during the election and the kind of evident failure of deliverism in like coming through on all these union issues and it not leading to higher vote shares among union members, do you think that makes it easier for like future Democratic administrations and candidates to better evaluate trade-offs and not necessarily prioritize some of these union demands over lowering prices or just building this abundance agenda?
Well, so I would say on that first, when you were talking about the whole thing about the neoliberal stuff, it's like I am not a neoliberal, and maybe I'm like overly academic, but like when I studied economics in college and political science, like there's a specific history and period of time of like neoliberalism, which is primarily associated with things like reducing welfare spending, bringing down the size of the state. That was like Thatcher Reaganism. And people sort of expanded it broadly because when Bill Clinton came into the office, like, he did welfare reform, and he like cut certain taxes from more affluent people, but raised other like it was very much like neoliberalism was a movement around like both like around sort of crushing, I think, labor protections and then around like austerity, essentially. Like the International Monetary Fund would go around to all these poor countries and say, like, the main thing you need to do to get our loans is like cut spending. And it's now become so like stretchy and broad a term that like when I criticize people who criticize neoliberalism, like I want to be clear that I want single payer healthcare, I like sectoral bargaining. I'm pretty left, but a lot of like what falls under the anti-neoliberal people is like very incoherent. And so I don't think, I mean, unless Trump does super tariffs and then actually does it and like crashes the economy, I think it's unlikely any presidential candidate is ever going to run on like free trade is great and like, full Cato Institute style that like the rhetoric doesn't work because generally speaking, anti-foreigner politics works well in every context. It is what it is. But the thing that really frustrates me is the whole thing about Biden. I read so many goddamn essays about like Biden is rejecting neoliberalism, right? Like he did the CHIPS Act, which is like bringing back manufacturing, the Rust Belt, IRA, Buy American requirements, all things that I think had good policy justifications, but it got wrapped into this like political strategy of like if we bring back the Rust Belt and like do all this manufacturing, it will win us politically. And I think some of it's like because of the procedural stuff, like a lot of stuff didn't actually get built. Like, so we didn't really deliver that much deliverism. Trump's going to get to deliver it, which sucks. But the other thing on that is that like people, yeah, it's like what just everyone told you over and over and over they're mad that prices are higher. And now you're like, what we need to do is like make prices even higher. Like the whole debate, that's what kind of drives me crazy is there was a long debate for a long time about like, well, people will tolerate higher prices if we like bring back manufacturing jobs, right? And the politics of it are worth it, and so on. And now people are just sort of pretending that they were never saying that, and actually like Fugazi, I don't know, they're not dealing with the cost stuff. They're like pretending that trade-off doesn't exist, and just like we need to double down on like protectionism, and also lying that we didn't do protectionism under Biden.
Yeah.
It's really just like it's all over. I know I'm like rambling, but it really frustrates me because I feel like I'm fighting like a squid or a jellyfish because it's hard to even pin down. Like
Yeah.
fundamentally, like people are really mad stuff was expensive. For many years, the argument was people will be okay with things being more expensive if it means these other benefits. And they clearly said no. And now you're saying let's keep doing that.
Yeah, and I saw that recent reporting as well that like the Biden administration was considering calling for repealing the Jones Act
Yeah.
to once inflation kind of started picking up to help with the supply chain stuff, and that Biden refused to because he felt like it would he was too loyal to
Yeah.
unions and felt like that would be betraying
On that, like again, I think labor unions are really important. I
absolutely.
think that like even on a very fundamental level, like management has collective bargaining. If you've ever worked at a large company, like they work together, right? Like your manager's not individually negotiating with you. And on a basic principle level, it makes sense that like we as workers should be able to organize together. I think what this election's really taught me is that like what is like the list of union policy demands formally doesn't always actually represent like what individual rank and file care about. Because like Biden gave all of these like organized labor interests, like went to the top, said, "What do you guys want?" He did it, and like we did okay, but a lot of those folks are still were like, "Well, stuff's expensive," and a lot of them are culturally more conservative. They care about immigration and transgender issues and stuff like that, and so. I think there's this mistake we've made broadly, not just with unions, but to say that these groups that say they speak for somebody, and if you give them what they want, they'll deliver votes. That's just not true. And labor's at least better with it because they have like real members, right? There's like whole argument, the groups that don't have members. Labor has members and they still cannot like fully just because you give them their policy wish list, make their members vote for you because their members might care about different things. Um, and I think Sean O'Brien, in retrospect, was a little prescient because he understood that, and I don't like the guy. Like I'm very loyal to a party, and I think he sold us out, sold his workers out to an anti-labor party. But part of it was like he understood that a lot of his members were not just because Biden did like gave them a huge bailout for their pension, did all the things that they wanted policy wise. It doesn't mean that the members were on board because that's not necessarily all that they care about.
100%. I'm gonna pass you off to David now. I think he has a question.
Okay, last thing on the Jones Act, I would just say is
yeah.
like Jones Act, the specific labor unions that like the Jones Act will be mad if it's repealed, but I would bet you the vast majority of union workers in America would be happier because it would be cheaper.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Clearly they really care about that.
Yeah, so I had a little bit of a question going back, kind of a opposite perspective on how partisanship relates to YIMBYism and NIMBYism, because I think, I don't know if Ben, you raised the prospect, or if it was your Armand, about like if it became a totally ideological issue, and kind of for a number of reasons. I know it plays differently nationally versus locally and on all the different levels, but I feel like that is kind of, personally, I think that's very likely to happen because there's just such a nationally, the rhetoric around building things and improving things infrastructurally is just so like positively charged. Like Trump obviously never did infrastructure, but he's always had a very strong rhetoric of building things like physical improvements will improve America, like as freedom cities and things like that. And I think that's I think in a more rhetorically important era than ever, when what's actually happening matters the least, I think it has a lot of potential to be a position that has broad consensus, but also is not actually conceding anything to like ideologies that we don't agree with. Because I mean, I think building things is generally important and good, especially infrastructure. And I think that especially like transportation infrastructure and transit has not been like Republicans have not been properly pushed on, kind of like from a like borderline nationalistic tone. Like you're anti-American if you don't support, bettering people's lives and building infrastructure, as opposed to all the other things that are
federal budget goes to. So I just kind of wanted to raise that opposite perspective of like YIMBYism and infrastructure as a unifying issue on a more national scale on that, and how it will play into YIMBYism will how you think it will affect presidential campaigns and national politics going forward.
I think it's a very good thing if more and more people across the political spectrum embrace the idea of building things. I think within the Trump coalition, there's a lot of tension between this idea that government wants to do lots of bad things, we need to stop them, and also we need to like build stuff and so on, and there's like a famous Steve Bannon quote where he's like, bring back I don't remember what he used some like very archaic term that we don't even like use anymore, or like the thing he was talking about haven't built for like 100 years, but like is this very visceral concept of like building physical things in America again. And I think there's a reason why, like, it kind of annoys me sometimes that people are so focused on manufacturing, because there's almost a sense that like a dude working in a factory in Ohio is like morally more important than like a Latina nurse in Georgia or something, right? Like, I think all jobs have work, and I don't think there's anything like morally superior to working in a factory as opposed to being a teacher. All right. But nonetheless, like I think there's a very strong, deep emotional desire and a sense of stagnation in America where we move very fast digitally. Like the stuff that we can do on our computers has changed in very few years. Like I have AI that I can talk to now. But the world around me physically has not changed that much. And if any sense, there's a sense of crumbling. But the tension is also that, Trump ran pretty heavily on like suburban women will be scared by building this stuff, or like public transit is like full of like degenerates and stuff like that. And so I don't know how you thread that, make sure that the positive and the pro building side of it wins out, as opposed to like scary new things will hurt you side of it. And on the Democratic side, there's like our entire environmentalist infrastructure has built the last 50 years around the idea of blocking things and trying to get them to rewire their DNA to be like in favor of building things. Very hard.
Yeah, I guess specifically you're saying like about within the Trump coalition, there's kind of a disconnect, and I feel like there's kind of an opportunity there, because I feel like despite the rhetorical like giant that Trump and Republicans are with their very diverse kind of media spheres and ways of attacking on issues, I feel like wholesale coming in out. And I guess when I was saying YIMBYism, I wasn't so much speaking to like more manufacturing, but just generally like clean energy, batteries, chips, things like that we need, that are important from a number of perspectives, that I feel like maybe Republicans, maybe especially some of the more progressive forms of infrastructure like clean energy and transit and things like that, and that it's kind of an opening because of the way in which the Republican coalition has shifted so rapidly, and the people that comprise it, it's more difficult for them to come out against any physical improvements.
And part of it, the genius of the IRA was that people think there's some strategic thing around it, which maybe they thought so, but like there was something in the IRA written that's like, if you're in a red district, like you get a +5 bonus. It's more that there's both like physical things, like land is cheaper, labor's cheaper, there's more of a manufacturing workforce, but like there's also just like legal things like permitting's easier and so on, the structural things. But what happened in practice is that we built a lot of clean energy or invested a lot of clean energy in districts that are Republican. And now, even though none of those people voted for it, now trying to repeal it would cost a lot of jobs in those areas and be pretty disruptive to those economies. And so it's built a bulwark of like resistance against like repeal. So I think that will be good. It's a lot of red areas that, again, like are not ideologically like I love wind. There are people who would happily support like a solar plant or a coal plant because they just want energy built and they don't want jobs and growth. And that, frankly, attitude has in some ways been more supportive of getting clean energy done than places that are like, we in theory like clean energy, but we will put up a zillion obstacles to make sure that like no one could possibly be offended by it and everyone who wants to sue it can.
Yeah, I'm always big on looking at the physical and like actual like effects of things versus what people say. And it's like
Yeah.
today, materially, like Texas is more pro clean energy than California is because of the
Yeah.
functionally because of the way they're doing things. And it's just like I feel like people need to look more at outcomes than ideology. But I will pass you on to Bella next.
Awesome. Great questions. Armand, I kind of want to take it, on a national level. My big thing is like, I study American politics, strategies, elections, media, and I kind of want to ask you a couple of questions. First question is, what happened, right? I mean, if you could explain this to like, the average American, the average lib that's like, oh, Armand, I'm really sad. Kamala Harris lost. We lost really bad. How could Donald Trump win again? What happened in this election?
I think anytime people ask this question, the first thing you need to frame is that there are two stories to be told. There's a longer story and then the short-term story. And everybody really over-indexes on the short-term story of like what the campaign could have done different, right? Like when Hillary ran against Donald Trump, some people were obsessed with like, what if Hillary had like spent more time in Wisconsin or whatever? And that election was so close that, maybe it would have made a difference. It was like any butterfly flapping its wings can cause like a hurricane 1,000 miles away, right? Chain of effect. But looking at that, I think the short-term story is just stuff was very expensive. People were very mad about it. They felt that immigration was out of control. There have been a lot of stories in the press about like chaos at the border and in New York City and big cities of like migrants um, causing issues in shelters and or not even causing issues, just like stressing city budgets, right? Stuff about how, the Lack and Riley story of an undocumented immigrant who like murdered someone. And so there's stuff that's like really built up that we didn't address. And that's both and that's like I would say in the last couple of years. And then there's even, I guess there's three. I lied. There's like the really short term is like, did she campaign with like Liz Cheney too much, or should she have run more ads about price gouging? And like, I think all of those things could have moved the needle in different ways. You can have infinite arguments about it, but the truth is, Kamala entered this election at a deep deficit. We were already losing, and then in the like, that's like the short run. The medium run is like with the structural factors of like migration and immigration, and then the very longer run is this overall like what does the Democratic Party represent to most people, right? That's where I really trying to focus on like the way I see it is like we should be beating Donald Trump by like 15 points, right? The man is crazy. If all you're arguing about is how we can like, oh, we could have won a narrow victory, you're kind of missing the point of this is a man who's so fundamentally rotten that the vast majority of people who've worked for him, like who've like come out and made endorsements, were against him. Um, it's never been true of like any president in history. People who are lifelong Republicans came out against him because he's just fundamentally like toxic, awful human being. So if you lose to someone like that, it really does suggest that you've structurally fucked up. And when I think about that, there's just a lot of like deeper things. Like I think one of it's like Democrats have not done a good job of demonstrating that the places they govern, they can do it well. People are moving from California to Florida and Texas because it's very expensive to live here. And a lot of people, but despite the fact that it's super expensive to live here, it's not like we have our trains are like okay, but compared to anywhere in the world, it's nothing. It takes forever to build anything. We had a $1.2 million toilet in Noe Valley. And so like blue state governance on a deep structural level has like not delivered the results that people want. And I think that's you see that where in blue cities, like there's been big swings for towards Republicans from the people that we're supposed to like really be fighting for, like working class people, people of color. I think the second thing that's like sort of long term is also just globally, if you look around the world, and this has been happening for like decades, is that college educated people have become much more left wing and working class people have become much more right wing. And the biggest divergence around that is that the sorting of like who has left-wing social opinions has really changed. It didn't used to be the case that like college educated people were like way more socially liberal than non-college educated people. And this is something I think needs a lot more study. I don't know the right answer to it, but it is just like you see in every Western democracy, you see it over and over, this divergence where working class folks are becoming more and more socially conservative around a lot of angles, and then college educated folks are becoming more socially liberal around a lot of angles. And like, so even when you see in France, for example, the parties that are like really left wing, the people who are on the left will often argue, be like, look, all we need to do is more economic populism. Like, don't give up
Yep.
any on social issues. And I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not at the truth is I don't know the answer. But what I do know is like the Communist Party that's very people call them like Mélenchon, the like French Bernie Sanders. People on the left love talking about internationally about how like left wing he is economically. What nobody likes talking about is that he's like real racist.
And especially on immigration, right? On
Yeah,
immigration,
on immigration.
especially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on immigration in particular, but also like weird stuff about Jews. Like he's an old school communist, and old school communists are like not very socially progressive people. And so yeah, I think and that's actually a good point though to make is like we think of social issues as like a big cloud, but like on abortion, for example, the public's become more socially liberal. On gay marriage, more socially liberal. But on like immigration, transgender issues, I think like around race, in complicated ways, because like we're not as racist as Jim Crow, but like racial tensions within different even races are like much higher intensity and like I don't know, it's complicated, but yeah, immigration in particular. So there is very, very high level. There's like a deep issue for Western democracies in general, where there's a big divergence between people who went to college and people who did not. And I don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that I was making this case to my class that, Kamala Harris herself, I don't think she could have done much more. We just saw the Biden internal numbers. It had him losing, I think, like New Jersey, and she almost lost New Jersey. It was, within
Yeah.
5, 6 points. So and anyone out there that is still defending Joe Biden and saying that he should have stayed in the race, I think you need to you are so delusional beyond repair. I don't know how to help you. I'm sorry. It's just like these people who are on Twitter saying, well, Joe Biden would have won in some of his inner circles. I'm like, we would have been wiped out. Kamala Harris saved the party, right?
No.
She by herself saved the party. But I want to just ask another question because you bring up a good point. I think immigration really hurt us this election cycle. And I was talking to Max about this back in DC because I'm an immigrant, right? My family, we seeked asylum when I was 3 years old on the border. And I saw it within the immigrant community. People within the immigrant community, people don't people on the left do not like talking about this. But a lot of immigrants here today were actually some of the most pro border security, anti-immigration, restrictionist types out there. And I kept telling Democrats and I kept telling people, we need to get serious on this issue. It was too late. And there was this perception that, hey, there's this open border, people just flooding in. And it goes back to a messaging thing that, at the end of the day, people are gonna, what they see on social media, what they see on their phones, what their friends are talking about, they're gonna believe that. And that also goes back to a tweet of yours that I thought was pretty interesting. I think you tweeted about yesterday about Joe Rogan saying that back in the day, the guy feuding over like the existence of dragons would have been a Democrat, and that kind of perfectly made sense to me. And I think what we're losing is, and the reason why we've created this podcast is because we're losing young men. I mean, you saw the shift. We all saw the shift. It was like a 20-point shift from
Yeah.
Biden in 2020. And what angers me is that there's all these libs on Twitter. They're like, oh yeah, young men just hate women. Maybe some young men are sexist. It's not the reason why they shifted to Trump. It is such it's a trope that isn't, first of all, you're blaming the voter. You're not going to get anyone back. Good job. You're just blaming people. Keep blaming people. That's what libs love doing. And I consider myself a lib. But a lot of libs love just blaming the voter and saying, well, they're stupid, well, they're dumb. Americans don't have time to take, 3, 4 hours of the day to watch politics, read politics. They're working 2, 3 jobs. And I think my question to you in all of this, this big rant is how do we get those people back? How do we get young men back? Right? Like, what do we have to do to get young men back in the Democratic Party? Is it maybe just like another charismatic leader who, is masculine presenting? Is it really as simple as that, as some claim? Or is there, a deeper meaning? Are there some more issues that we need to focus on? Is there a reaction kind of to the quote unquote woke left?
I can only give you like speculation and thoughts because I think this is one of those. It goes back to like the short term, medium, and long term. All the short term stuff, I have like pretty strong opinions, and they're easy to data test. Like I think the price gouging, the ads that perform best actually were the like combining the YIMBY message of pro housing and price gouging. So like we could have moved the needle more. I think like Liz Cheney should have just not done it. I don't think it helped. I don't think it mattered, but people really elevated it too much online. But the long run, like it's like a lot of people are trying to figure out why young men left. And I'll say what I'll do to structure this is first to tell you where I think we're kind of like screwing up in our response. And then second is like where I think we could do better. So for the first one thing I really noticed is like there's a very comfortable tendency amongst liberals in particular to want to sort of like be like these are the bad people, but also it's very like strong in lib culture that like people of color can't be the bad people. And so when you get in this, that's something that like really annoyed me is like people like dove right back into the 2016 stuff of like you'll say like white young men did this, did that.
Yep.
Like, well, and it's I think frankly an entire discourse that just pretends Latinos don't exist is fucking racist.
Latino men, yes, exactly.
Yeah, like young Latino men in particular.
Exactly.
Swing, all right? And amongst black voters, the only group that really swung was black men, particularly young black men. It wasn't as huge. And so, yeah, like that response where it's just like, well, these people who did it are bad. It's very comfortable and easy for liberals if they can do it around like acceptable villains, like white men, and I say acceptable villains because I am a white man and like there's this weird thing where I don't get offended by people going around being like white men are so bad because like I know that it's like kind of a fake puffery, right? Like there's a room full of white guys and I've been in nonprofits where it's like half the people are like white dudes and the bosses are like white guys and they'll performatively go around saying how like bad white men are and we need to combat systemic inequity. I'm like, and just like who is this for, right? Like, which is all pretending and it's nonsense. I would much rather like we don't do this shit and then the people in the room who are people of color get paid more. How about that? But that's my little rant on that. But so what I would say is like we need to get away from these comfortable methods of like performative, I don't know, signaling within our coalition because it really breaks it when you're like
fake activism. I'm gonna say it.
Yeah. Well, and also like you can't do this anymore because the reality is staring against you. 2016, you could at least try to do the like evil white working class men, but like now you've lost for not that. And some people have gone full off the deep end and be like, well, no, be racist against
and she did well with white. I thought she did pretty solid with white voters compared to Biden. I don't think there was like a major drop off.
I think she held even and did a little bit better amongst like college educated white men in particular. But there was swings pretty much in all demographics. But really the biggest thing is just like individual change really, particularly like Latino young men, huge swings. And some people it's funny, there's like two camps of it. I'm going to listen to this longer than I wanted to, but like it drives me so crazy. There's a camp that just like, I'm going to pretend it did not happen, right? They're like, I'm just going to be like, these white women are betraying us, or like, there's one person who's like, women and like black voters have to keep holding us up, and like these white men did it. And I'm like, you literally just like pretended we live in a country where like Latinos don't exist when they're the second biggest like racial group. Like what is and like but then the other people, and you see this with some of the Gaza stuff too, are there's like straight up racist, like I hope you get deported, you get what you deserve. Like that's not ugh, like
I've seen those too.
The truth is, even if you think the people who voted for Trump are like evil and bad people, which I don't. I think most people are decent and kind and they vote because of like politics is not the thing that they really care about. They don't sit and analyze the issues, and sometimes they really do, and they have different values. And I don't think you can paint people that broadly. But even if you think someone who voted for Trump is a bad person, guess what? Bad person's vote counts just as much as yours. So probably even more because they're in a swing state, you know? Like if you're just feeling really smug and self-satisfied about how good you are while you keep getting your ass kicked, like serves nobody. Um, that whole rant said, how do we like win back these young men? I think one of it just like I am really, really pushing back against anybody who's trying to do the shun the witch thing, where it's like, oh, you talked to this person? Did you know they had problematic
And
tweets?
I appreciate that you're doing that, by the way. I see that on Twitter. I appreciate that.
I, I, you would never apply this standard in your normal life, right? Like my parents are like really right wing, and they say like things I really don't like. But they also think things I believe in support. Like they think Democrats are the devil, yet they're still like, good job supporting that candidate you cared about, you know? Humans don't operate that way where they have an ideological litmus test for everyone they hang out with. And also, most people, like, if you're a party actor or involved in politics, you're kind of pressured to have, not pressured in a mean way, but you form an ideologically coherent worldview and you have this set of positions. But the amount of actual people who 100% agree with either the GOP or the Democratic platform is tiny, tiny. Like, and it's all over the place. Like, there's people who are like, I think the war in Iraq was great, but also like we need to stop bombing Gaza. Like people are a complicated mix, and this whole thing where we tried to like deplatform Joe Rogan and so on, like it just did not work.
Joe Rogan in 2020, when Bernie went on, I think is the epitome of this and kind of represents the Democratic philosophy of the last decade and just the response that came from him. The frankly like bad faith response, the fact that Joe Biden was sending out tweets at the time attacking Bernie for that. And now that we've lost all these people, that the talking point is like, we need our own Joe Rogan, and that it was very self-inflicted. And Joe Rogan, I think, took note of that, and other people like it took note of that response.
Well, I think that's actually very telling when people the way they're responding to it. It's like the whole not a lot of the people are making arguments online right now. You have to understand because I worked in like the progressive nonprofit ecosystem. They want to get funding for their project, right? And so the arguments they'll make are around how do I make sure that more dollars go, and I don't think they're doing it instinctive in like greedy or evil way. This is like they believe what they do is good and they're trying to figure out ways to do it. So of course the first response is like, why don't liberal left-wing foundations donate and fund like a liberal Joe Rogan? It's like Joe Rogan's not funded by like Cato or Heritage, right? It's all downstream. It's there is a reason that people like Joe Rogan started moving towards the right because of a culture that exists. And you're not going to artificially create that. I mean, the whole Tim Walz thing that really annoyed me too is that, anyway, I think Tim Walz is great. There's so much of this like almost condescending attitude where like if we take somebody with opinions that these people hate, but stick him in a camo and he's drinking beer, like you can trick them. Like they're so dumb, these voters. Like no, like the American voter, I think people feel more comfortable thinking that the voters share their values but are too stupid to get it than they are with thinking, oh, maybe the voters are smarter than I thought, but they don't have the same moral principles I do. Because that's really uncomfortable. And yeah, that like pisses people off. And so there's this whole attitude of like we can just like artificially trick people into agreeing with us. It's like they don't agree on a lot of things, and you need to either try to like, it differs on different things on policy. Like some things like I think on asylum, it's gotten so far that unfortunately, like, I'm somebody who's really pro-immigrant. Like I think we have to make real substantive concessions to
Yep.
mitigate the flows so people are less pissed
I
off.
agree. As a former asylum seeker, I agree.
I'm the child of refugees, and literally my uncle was like complaining about like I wanted to mention that earlier. I forgot. He's like complaining about all these migrants coming in. I'm like, bro, you were a migrant. Like,
It's so prevalent in the immigrant community and refugees. It's crazy.
and it's I think yeah, there's stuff where it's like I think we have to give in on substance, unfortunately, because we let it get out of control. I think there, but then other areas where you're like, I'm not going to give up my principles. Fine, then argue for them, persuade people. Don't do this like, well, you're a bad person and like we're gonna shun you and put you away. Like even if you think that's what they deserve, it doesn't work. It just has not worked. Like you can't just pretend, and especially when it comes to a lot of it came from like political debates. This is how I just like cargo culting so much in politics, where people like have one idea and it like gets copied and becomes a bad copy where it doesn't no longer applies. Um, there were this ideas of like we can shun people who have politically very toxic opinions, like they're super racist or whatever. And that works if you are the majority, right? But if you are even somewhat mixed, like on transgender issues, I'm very pro trans rights. And we tried to do something similar there where it's like anybody who's like even asking questions about like, well, how would it be fair for my daughter to compete or whatever. We didn't say like, oh, well, there's these health guidelines you can follow and standards for testing or so on. We just were like, shut up, you're a bad person. And like that just doesn't work when the public doesn't agree with you. And so in situations where public doesn't agree with you, you can't just be like, we will try to like say these people are bad and like isolate them and deplatform them. You have to actually argue and you have to make the argument. And I think that's where people miss. I'm always even sensitive talking about this stuff because people misinterpret what I'm saying as saying like we have to give it up and throw them away. What I'm saying is the approach of saying we can just like stick our head in the sand and ignore it has not worked. I think we have the winning side of the argument, but we have to actually make it. We have to show up to those places and say, here's what I believe, here's why I believe it. As opposed to being like, I'm not going to go on your podcast. Well, like if 80% of people agree with that podcast and you don't show up and try to persuade them, you're going to lose.
Yeah. No, I mean, I see it on campus here at UCLA. I always try to tell students, talk to people that you don't agree with, because you'll find out on a lot of issues you do agree with them. Right? I have a couple of conservative buddies here, and I make an effort to talk to them and kind of meet them just to see where they are, and we go out and get food, just and they agree with a lot of the housing stuff. So it goes back to that bipartisan issue, but I think it's just really interesting how we've
People
kind
change
of.
their minds.
Yeah, and if you and
Sure.
my whole point is if you're not speaking to people who disagree with you, there's no way you're going to build your coalition. You're not going to expand your coalition by going on, I'm sorry, MSNBC every single day. The Pod Save America, great guys, amazing guys.
Yeah.
But the only people that listen to them are like suburban, I don't know, college educated people, right? And it's like I'm not saying don't go on their podcasts and shows, but expand your horizon, right? Just expand it a little bit. Go and speak to people you don't agree with necessarily on every single issue.
Well, question for you guys, actually, I'm curious about is when you chose the name Progressive for this podcast, I feel like that will filter. I mean, that's a great name, but part of what makes Joe Rogan, I hate to keep using him, but he's just like the easiest example, like effective. It's like this is the Joe Rogan Republican podcast, right? It's a podcast about general things, and then like he has conservative ideas that like trickle in. Why do you guys feel like having explicit is your intention to talk to other people who are already progressives about how they can outreach better, or is it like you want to bring in people who aren't necessarily progressives already?
So that was actually a point of debate with us when we were formulating this. And so with that name, we felt that was the one that would represent the four of us the best and technically the mission, right? The objective of the podcast is to make progressivism, liberalism, whatever you want to call it, accessible to the bros, a space and a place for bros to talk, right? Guys to talk about things in an accessible manner, sports, politics, all things that apply to our lives, right? And of course, like you said, in the Joe Rogan manner, where it's not just one specific thing, but I guess we settled on progressive just because it illustrated who we are. And, yes, it does have that risk of running out of like, I don't want to say room to grow, but like you said, room to grow. But we feel as though bringing on a diverse cast of people from ideological ranges, all over the spectrum, right? Fit that new narrative of how we're going to go about this, how we're going to attack issues. And more importantly, we're trying to make it accessible, right? In a progressive, simple, plain term manner. And obviously having you was great. And of course, in the future, we'd like to have, conservative ideologues, depending on who is willing to show up. And so that was the driving factor, right? We're all young, college educated, liberal leaning men, but we wanted to make it bro-centric, air quotes, right? Centric for people like that, right? A place for, again, bros to talk, discuss things, and of course, politics being the main focus, but of course, sports, lifestyle factors. I mean, Belay obviously is a huge Chargers fan. I'm not sure if you know extensively. This guy loves, was it Justin Herbert, right?
Love Justin Herbert. That's my goat.
But all that to say, that's was the driving factor behind all of this. And so that's kind of what we thought about. And of course, subject change, one of those things where we're flexible and we're trying to make it a place and a space for bros to be bros, right? Guys to hang out, to talk, and discuss things in a manner that's civil, accessible, and just all in all reasonable.
Yeah.
I also think I think progressive, it is sort of explicitly political, but I also think it's a little bit disguised for normies where they might not immediately connect it to progressive necessarily. And we are still planning to like have some kind of sports centric stuff, and hopefully that'll provide an opening where it's not like the left wing blah blah blah. Like it's a little disguised there where it's the bro part might lean more heavily on some of the episodes, and some of them might be a little more explicitly political like this one, but we're hoping
you gotta get like a left-leaning bodybuilder on here.
Oh, Max and Ben are bodybuilders.
Hold on. No. Sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, Blake, but that is actually my biggest thing. I have been a personal trainer for 3.5 years at UC Santa Barbara. This is going to be my 4th year going into it. And Armand, you live off in the Bay, so you'll know where this is better than I do. But San Leandro 2023, I was and in the men's physique category for the men's OCB Bay Area Bodybuilding Championships. I gave that up. I'm done with that career, but that was what was.
Yeah, I need you guys to not wear jackets and sweaters on the Zoom. You guys just show
what are you
muscles,
doing,
bro.
man? Like you were like you wear tech. Did you guys watch my YIMBYs for Harris, right? Of
course.
Yeah. My outfit, like I was the America overalls. You gotta something like that. Like, if you're a bodybuilder,
I have my Kamala tank up there.
Yeah.
Well,
Ben has a
photo. Nice.
Ben has like a kind of a big photo on his. Is it still pinned, Ben?
It probably is.
Yeah, it's like him in a Kamala tank, and bro, just shredded, just like absolutely insane. The quads are crazy. I'll send. Yeah, it's. But Armand, real quick, another point of the progressive thing is, I think we want it to be authentic and honest. I think voters appreciate, if we just tell them up front, hey, we are center left. We do consider ourselves progressives, but we are here, willing to engage in conversations. I think that's the other reason why I kind of went back and forth. And I was like, hey, let's, make it known that we do lean left, but we're still bros. And at the end of the day, we want to be honest with our viewers and tell them the truth. And honestly, I asked people around me if they knew what progressive meant, and they went back to like the insurance company.
Yeah.
So I think, it's pretty funny, but.
Well, it's one of those things.
I get that. I mean, I think it's got to be part of what makes, if you look at like the top 10 podcasts, right? Like, they're all even the ones that's like top 10, I think Lib Podcast, The Daily, but Marco Barbara is like very authentically like an NPR latte sipping, like liberal cliche. My girlfriend listens. I don't listen to it. My girlfriend listens to it like every day. And I think part of it is whatever your view is, it's not something where it's like, I'm coming in with the strategy to make people do this. It's like, you got to be you, and people pick up on it.
Exactly.
Owens is like one of the top ones, and she's fucking crazy. But she's very authentically crazy. Like, and I don't mean this as like, I think all Republicans are crazy. Like, this woman's like ancient aliens crazy. So yeah, I think anyone who tries to comment, like ads, you can be cynical about. It's like you cut an ad, you're trying to be strategic and so on. That's sustainable for the purpose of an ad, paid media, but like earned media, just like getting people to listen, like you can't fake it. You got to be who you are more than anything else.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. It's like, it's one of those things where, with this place, or this podcast, and the way that I see this going, one of the concepts I raised to Belay when we were formulating it, I wanted this to be a place with it's going to sound strange, but like a rotating cast, right? I felt as though one of the key tenets should be that this is not a stagnant thing. This is a dynamic, changing thing. Obviously, this is the 4 of us and how we started it, but I hope to bring on friends. I hope to have episodes where I'm not involved. I hope to have episodes where it's like we talk all manners of things that I don't understand. Belay loves sports, obviously, and like I look, I'll be honest with you, I can't do sports. Look, again, bodybuilding, love
I'm
it.
trying to
I
get him
talk to you about
into
that
it. I'm trying.
all day. But you ask me anything about football, it's like my brain goes blank. It's my worst habit, but that's kind of one of those core tenets of like we all have distinct personalities, and I'm hoping really to expand this with like a rotating cast of characters. Some people who come on more frequently, some who don't, and people who can bring diverse perspectives into this of authentic personalities and a place, again, keyword being a place and a space for the bros to talk.
As a person who like listens to podcasts all the time, I think what just happened there between Max and Belay was great because it's like part of I got a little self-conscious because I felt like I was monologuing because I have a lot of thoughts, but you guys have your friends, like you have good chemistry. It's like fun. Like I listen to podcasts around stuff where it's like there's a good energy and people seem to having a good time. Like talk to each other, like interrupt each other. Like when you guys are like bantering about like I actually have never seen this situation where there's like a sports bro nerd and then like a bodybuilding nerd. Like interact. That's like a very interesting
Pretty
dynamic.
interesting.
Yeah, like
well,
interrupt each other. Like don't like patiently wait for me to just
Yeah, Max, you should get into the Chargers, bro. You should become a Chargers fan.
yeah.
it's man, I'm telling you, it's like Sunday morning rolls around, but the wife wants to go do stuff, and Blaze like blowing up my phone. He's like, look at this, like I don't know, the Justin Herbert,
Bro,
whatever.
50-yard
Like,
bomb, Justin Herbert,
You gotta be back to be like, look at this, Mr. Olympia, like fucking this guy could crack any, the skull of a guy
you
between
crack
legs.
Justin Herbert.
Yeah. Or like, yo, bro, I'm sleeping in a big bed with my wife, and you're like, a bunch of dudes running around in tights. Like, I don't know.
it's no Jesus.
This is Ben, by the way.
You
Oh,
can't.
wow. Shit.
In Orange
Man,
County. Bro, look at them quads, bro. Look at them quads.
That is insane. You were hiding all of that.
That's what I tell them. I tell them to show it.
You have not picked that up at all, like from this.
No
we got
clothing next
Gym
time.
Shark
No
at
shirts,
least.
no sweaters.
Dude, it's like 40 degrees out in Santa Barbara, man. It's way too
I don't
cold.
care. We need views. I'm kidding.
Buddy, I wore nothing but American flag overalls in fucking San Francisco Pacific Heights with those fog. People ask me like, why did you have the like tights underneath? I was like, because I was freezing.
No, that picture went hard though. It was worth it.
That was a sick photo.
We need more of that shit. Like I know I hope you guys keep in mind, Democrats in general, like when the McDonald's thing happened, like Trump did this little McDonald's stuff, there's some people are like, ugh, it's so like tacky and fake and that like and then their polls done, they asked, they asked them of all these different things. Do you remember seeing this?
Yep.
And the number one thing, by far, any campaign stuff that happened, was the McDonald's Trump stunt.
I remember right after that happened, I was like, this is like such an amazing thing. Like I think I was like dooming at the time.
David, you were getting shit on lip
I
Twitter
said
for
Future
saying that.
YIMBYism did this. I was like,
David predicted the Electoral College. He nailed it. Every single state.
well, that's
Literally
because
nailed
I'm
it.
a little bit schizophrenic and it changed every day, and I happened to post.
But it
one
worked.
day.
No, that one worked, and everyone was shitting on him.
Stunts work. Stunts work. Politics is pro wrestling.
Politics
They
is
need to
very
learn that.
visual. Like I wore that because I knew that when I show up, all the journalists would run a beeline to me, and they did because like it's a great photo. And politics is a visual and it sticks in minds, like the Trump McDonald's thing. How like literally like nobody heard about the fact that Kamala Harris had this like huge, really great plan for expanding Medicare for like home health aides. And I'm a little bit older than y'all, so like we have relatives who are going through stuff like that, and it's like really expensive and difficult. And I was like, wow, that would really make our lives better. Nobody knew about it. Nobody heard about it.
17
Trump,
seconds of media coverage or something like that.
yeah, and then Trump like goes to McDonald's and like I'm seeing it. My always thing is like I have a lot of friends who are not political, and I see their Instagrams and whatever. And that was one thing where they're like making memes about it and laughing about it.
And they would send us the photos from like World Star and all those accounts,
Yes.
and that's how I gauge it too. Yeah.
That I think Democrats need to understand how to do stunts and policies that end up on those non-political pages, the World Stars,
Right.
the Rap TV.
But that's a real tension for us as a coalition because we are so dominant, especially like not our voters are one thing, but the people who talk about being Democrats and policy and blah, blah, blah online, we're all like college educated people, and that comes with a lot of like manners like I think part of the reason I'm able to see through that little is like I grew up very poor and working class. So a lot of things that people like my partner, I love her very much. But she grew up she's like I'm a white guy, she's a person of color, but her family in the Philippines came from some affluence. They grew up with like they even though they were poor when they moved to the US, like you kind of transmit those like norms and things about like and so she often thinks, and she loves my parents, but she often thinks a lot of things they do are kind of like gauche. Even though they have money now, but they spend money the way that people who were once poor spend money, if you know what I mean. Like they buy like the big red wine that's like not actually, if you're in the know, you could get something cheaper that's like classier or whatever. We're all just that's why so many people were like repulsed by the McDonald's stunt. Is like it seemed tacky and gauche and like kind of like, ugh, like you don't do that. Um, but like most people aren't like that. We're weird.
Yeah, it's really like there was a massive, like everywhere, people are saying Kamala Harris didn't work at McDonald's, and then Trump like pretended to work at a McDonald's for a day, but that's what people are going to care about because that's what they saw. Like
Right, people were so mad about the fact that like, well, it's like it's fake and so on, and like
well, everything is politics is a show. It's
yeah.
about like who's the better play.
She should have like
She should have went to McDonald's and been like, "This is the McDonald's I worked at, you
Yeah.
motherfuckers. Look at this. These are my coworkers. Fuck you all."
Kamala Harris should have gone to a coal mine. Like
Or like when she talked to the guns thing, actually, really, I noticed getting when she talked about Oprah, it got a lot of traction outside of like even our circles.
Go to a shooting range.
Surprising. Yeah, go to a shooting range.
So all in all, I want to say thank you, Armand, for coming on today. This has been our inaugural episode of Progressive. This is a place and space for the bros to chat with Belay Thoma, Ben Bartlett, and David Roach. Again, I'm Maximilian Levin. This has been Progressive. So thanks again for coming on today, and we're looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.